Maxwell Langford, the most feared man in the city's underground, froze mid-step. His eyes locked on the delicate gold locket glinting against the black uniform of the young waitress standing before him. For a moment, it was as if the air itself had thickened, pressing down on the patrons of the dimly lit Italian restaurant. A tense silence fell. Whispers flickered across the room as they sensed something in the air, a sudden, inexplicable shift around the man who had never shown fear. His hand trembled over his glass of wine. Maxwell's chest tightened, and a raw, uncontrolled emotion surged through him. The Mafia boss, the man whose name alone commanded loyalty and dread across continents, burst into tears. Jessie, the waitress, froze in place, unsure what she had done to provoke such a reaction. Her dark eyes widened as she instinctively reached up to touch the locket at her neck, unaware that the simple piece of jewelry she wore had just shattered the walls around one of the most dangerous men alive. That small, gold locket, plain, almost unremarkable to anyone else, was the key to a mystery Maxwell had carried for 20 years. A tragedy, a lost child, a secret buried deep beneath grief and rage now glimmered against the dim light. Could this ordinary young woman before him be the daughter he had mourned for decades? The thought made his heart hammer in ways bullets never had. Welcome back. Hit the subscribe button and let know what time you are watching this. Tomorrow, I will bring to you a more thrilling story, so don't miss. The contrast was stark and jarring. Maxwell, a figure of absolute power and fear, now vulnerable and trembling, confronted by Jessie, young, resilient, and wholly unaware of the secret she carried. Their worlds collided in a moment that drew every eye in the restaurant, creating a charged silence that made the clinking of silverware feel deafening. For anyone who has ever felt overlooked or underestimated, this was a moment of truth. Even the quietest, most unassuming person can hold the key to changing someone else's life entirely. If you believe in the power of unseen courage, this story is for you. Maxwell struggled to compose himself. He motioned for Jessie to step aside, his voice low, almost hesitant. "That necklace, where did you get it?" he asked, his words trembling despite his efforts to appear calm. Jessie blinked, surprised, then replied softly, "It was a gift from my mother, my adoptive mother." Her words offered no answers, only questions, and Maxwell felt the weight of 2 decades pressing down on him. Memories he had buried rushed back. The hospital room filled with sterile lights, the faint cry of a baby that should have been his daughter, and the sudden, unbearable silence that followed his wife's death. 4 years, he had ruled his empire with an iron fist, seeking control over everything he could touch, yet he had never felt powerless like this. Jessie watched him, puzzled by the sudden intensity in his gaze. There was something in his eyes, grief, longing, a depth of loss she couldn't yet name. Maxwell took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, though the tremor in his hands betrayed him. He had spent decades building walls of fear and respect around himself, but this single shining locket, had found a crack in those walls. He needed to know. He needed answers. And he would get them, no matter how long it took. Because tonight, in this quiet restaurant under the soft glow of chandelier lights, a lost connection had resurfaced. A connection that would change both their lives forever. As Jessie returned to her duties, Maxwell's mind raced. Every decision he had made, every enemy he had crossed, every life he had taken to maintain control of his empire suddenly felt meaningless compared to the possibility standing right in front of him. That necklace was not just a piece of jewelry, it was a lifeline, a bridge to a past he thought he had lost forever. He left the restaurant abruptly, slipping into the shadows of the city streets, but he knew this was only the beginning. The hunt for truth had begun. And nothing, not even the dangerous empire he commanded, would stop him from uncovering the story behind that gold locket, and the girl who wore it. As he disappeared into the night, Jessie paused by the counter, glancing down at the locket with a quiet, unknowing reverence. Neither of them realized how tightly fate had drawn their lives together, nor the dangers, betrayals, and revelations that awaited. But in that moment, destiny had whispered, and both would be changed forever. It was the beginning of a story neither had expected, one of loss, of rediscovery, and of a bond that could survive even the darkest shadows of the past. The city streets stretched out like a web of lights and shadows as Maxwell Langford disappeared into the night. His mind refused to stay in the present. It was already dragging him backward, into memories he had long tried to bury. Memories of a life that had ended before it truly began, of a happiness snatched away by cruel fate. He saw her face, soft, luminous, and fleeting, his late wife, Helena. She had been 24, radiant and fearless, the kind of woman who could light a room with nothing more than her smile. And he had loved her beyond reason, beyond fear, beyond the cold rules of his empire. Together, they had dreamed of a family, a daughter who would carry their love into the future. The day she gave birth should have been the most joyous of their lives. Maxwell had stood at the hospital door, pacing the sterile floors, his heart hammering with excitement and nerves. But the joy had twisted into horror within moments. Helena had gone into unexpected complications during childbirth, and their daughter, his little girl, was pronounced stillborn. Maxwell remembered the shrill cries of doctors, the cold sterility of the room, the hush that fell over him as Helena's eyes, glazed with pain and exhaustion, searched his for hope. He had held her hand and promised, silently, that he would protect everything she had loved, everything they had dreamed of, but even his iron resolve could not shield them from grief. But even then, something felt wrong. He couldn't place it. An instinct gnawed at him, subtle and insistent. The nurse who had attended them had been overly precise, almost too practiced, when she relayed the news. The doctor avoided his gaze. Small things, a pause too long, a glance that lingered, a form that slipped unseen from the corner of his eye. Maxwell didn't know yet that his intuition would later reveal a truth more dangerous than the violence he wielded in his empire. In the days that followed, the grief consumed him. Helena's funeral had been a blur of flowers, candles, and condolences that meant nothing. The city had mourned her, but no one truly understood the depth of the loss. His loss. His daughter, stolen before she had a chance to cry, to breathe, to exist. And yet, amid the mourning, another darkness had taken root: anger. Rage at the fragility of life, at the unfairness of fate, at the vulnerability of those he loved. That anger had forged a new Maxwell Langford, one colder, sharper, more ruthless than before. Where once he had sought control over only his own destiny, now he sought dominance over everything, everyone who might threaten him or the few he cared for. The empire he had built over the next 2 decades was unrelenting. Streets that once knew his name in whispers now trembled at it. Every ally was scrutinized, every potential enemy watched and measured. Loyalty was bought, demanded, enforced. Blood had been spilled, contracts had been signed in silence, and Maxwell had learned to move through the shadows with precision. But still, the hollow ache in his chest persisted. Meanwhile, across the city, Jessie navigated her own life, far removed from the world of power, crime, and vengeance. She moved through her days with resilience, a quiet determination born of necessity. The lunch rush at the small Italian cafe was relentless, and she balanced orders, tips, and the ever-present hum of stress that accompanied life for someone without the safety net of wealth or influence. Her adoptive mother's lessons, kindness, patience, the value of hard work, guided her, though she could not have guessed how crucial they would become. Her locket, a modest gold piece with a soft engraving she had never scrutinized too closely, rested against her chest as she moved between tables. To Jessie, it was a keepsake, a token of love from a woman who had given her everything she could. But to Maxwell, unseen and yet present in the shadows of memory, that locket was a key to a life he had thought irretrievably lost. Jessie had no inkling that her ordinary struggles, her laughter shared with coworkers, the gentle way she offered a smile to the elderly couple at table 7, were moments that bridged 2 worlds. She carried her adoptive mother's love without realizing it was also carrying the echo of a family torn apart by lies and greed. Even as she juggled her tasks, a few regulars noticed her exhaustion and paused to comment, but her smile never wavered. She had learned early that life demanded resilience, and she gave it freely, unaware of the threads of destiny weaving toward her. Back in the empire Maxwell commanded, his lieutenants were not blind to his momentary distraction. In the quiet corners of the city, his underworld rivals sensed weakness in his recent demeanor, an almost imperceptible hesitation, a distracted tone during a meeting, a glance that lingered too long toward his phone. Opportunists stirred, their instincts sharp. The city whispered of a king distracted, a ruler whose guard had slipped for the first time in decades. Meanwhile, Maxwell moved with purpose through the city streets, reviewing his memories. He remembered the subtle manipulations of the hospital staff, The way the nurse had kept her hand steady, the doctor's furtive notes and sudden absence during critical moments. Something had been altered, rewritten, hidden from him. He didn't yet know how deep the conspiracy ran. Only that instinct and grief had guided him to notice cracks even back then. Jessie's life, seemingly ordinary, moved on in parallel. She cared for her younger siblings, stretched her paycheck, and harbored dreams she rarely allowed herself to voice aloud. She was unaware that the gold locket at her neck was the same one Maxwell had given his wife, engraved with initials that only a father could recognize. That connection, invisible to her, was the tether pulling two worlds toward collision. Even the Mafia's murmurings and plots could not yet touch her, though Maxwell's enemies already began sensing the danger she represented. In their minds, anyone tied to the Kingpin's personal life could be leveraged, threatened, or exploited. A minor intimidation, an anonymous note slipped under a door, a shadowy figure waiting outside her workplace, hinted at the chaos waiting just beyond the periphery of her daily life. As Maxwell passed beneath the glow of a street lamp, his mind returned to Helena's final days. The sterile white of the hospital, the small, hurried motions of staff, and the quiet lies that had hidden the truth, it all pressed upon him with the force of memory and regret. He realized that grief alone could no longer define him. Action was necessary, but careful, precise action. He could not afford to reveal too much too soon. Somewhere across the city, Jessie wiped down the counter after the lunch rush, her fingers brushing lightly against the locket. The engraving caught the light, glinting faintly, and she smiled faintly at the familiar weight. A simple act, but one that unknowingly deepened the bond with a man whose life was defined by power, danger, and loss. Maxwell paused, letting the memories settle. He knew now that his daughter, or the girl he believed lost, might still exist. The thought ignited a fire within him that rivaled any street-level ambition he had ever felt. He would find the truth, uncover the conspiracy, and protect her. The night stretched on, silent except for the city's distant hum. Jessie closed the cafe for the evening, unaware of the invisible threads connecting her to the world's most dangerous man. Maxwell retreated into the shadows, his mind a swirl of grief, hope, and unrelenting determination. Tomorrow he would begin quietly, subtly, to uncover the truths hidden in plain sight. The hospital records, the nurse and doctor, the locket's origin. Each step would bring him closer to Jessie, and to the answers he had sought for 20 years. And somewhere in the stillness, a sense of inevitability lingered. Paths that had long run parallel were finally converging. The shadows of the past were moving toward the present, and the first flicker of connection had been struck, a spark that would ignite a chain of events no one could have foreseen. Maxwell's empire, his grief, his enemies, and his heart, all would collide in the days to come. But tonight, he allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The possibility that loss did not have to be permanent, and that even the most powerful man could be guided, humbled, and transformed by the courage of an ordinary young woman. Jessie, meanwhile, adjusted the locket on her neck and glanced toward the closed doors of the cafe, unaware that her life was about to change forever. The past had found her, and the present was waiting. Maxwell Langford, Kingpin, father, and man haunted by shadows, would see to that. Maxwell Langford's footsteps echoed softly against the polished tiles of the restaurant as he returned the following evening. The establishment, modest yet elegant, hummed with the quiet rhythm of dinner service. Patrons whispered among themselves, some glancing surreptitiously at the man in the tailored suit whose presence seemed to bend the air with authority. Maxwell, however, barely noticed them. His focus was singular, the young waitress with the gold locket, whose ordinary grace had unsettled him in ways bullets and threats never could. He requested a private meeting under the guise of a business discussion, asking the manager to allow Jessie a moment in the back room. She appeared cautiously, wiping her hands on her apron, her smile polite but wary. Maxwell motioned toward the small, dimly lit room near the kitchen, a quiet corner where the world beyond the restaurant's walls seemed to fade. "Thank you for meeting me," Maxwell began, his voice low but carrying the unmistakable cadence of command. Jessie nodded, a subtle tension tightening her shoulders. She had seen powerful men before, but there was something in Maxwell's gaze, a quiet intensity, a weight behind his words, that felt unlike any other encounter. "I wanted to talk to you about this," he said, his hand gesturing toward the locket resting against her collarbone. His eyes softened, but a shadow of grief lingered, making his usual authority seem fragile. "Where did you get it?" Jessie's brow furrowed slightly. "It's a gift from my adoptive mother," she said carefully, as if aware there was more at stake than just a casual question. She gave it to me when I was 16. It's just a locket." She touched it instinctively, tracing the engraving without looking down. Maxwell's gaze lingered longer than it should have, a storm of emotions warring within him. Anger, sorrow, disbelief, and a long-dormant hope churned together. He had spent 20 years believing his daughter lost, gone in a flurry of hospital errors, or worse, deliberate malice. And yet, here was a living thread, a fragile connection made tangible in gold. "It's very special," he said finally, carefully measuring his tone. "Does it have a story?" His words were gentle, probing, yet weighted with an undercurrent of unspoken grief. Jessie smiled faintly, a mixture of pride and humility. "It belonged to my mom before me. She said it reminded her of the people who had to leave and the people who stayed. I never thought much of it, really. I just like it." The simplicity of her words struck Maxwell harder than any revelation could have. She carried her ordinary life, her joys, her struggles, and her love without ever knowing the power that simple objects could hold over someone else's heart. To Maxwell, she was both completely ordinary and utterly extraordinary. For a long moment, neither spoke. The soft hum of the restaurant outside the back room pressed in, the clatter of dishes and quiet conversations serving as a backdrop to the tension between them. Maxwell studied her, noticing the subtle resilience in her posture, the way she met his gaze without fear, the hint of defiance that was not born of arrogance but of necessity. "Do you wear it all the time?" he asked quietly. Jessie nodded. "Almost. It reminds me of my mom, and I guess I like having something that feels like she's still here, even if just a little." Her voice wavered slightly, but she held her composure. Maxwell's chest tightened. He had spent years defining his life by control and intimidation, yet here was a young woman who had never wielded power yet possessed it fully through her courage, kindness, and authenticity. And he was drawn to it, helplessly, irrevocably. "I see," he said finally, forcing his voice into neutrality. "Thank you for sharing that." Yet the calm exterior was a thin veneer. Inside, he was unraveling, weighing the impossibility of the moment against his rational mind, trying to find a path that would allow him to discover the truth without shattering her world. Jessie shifted slightly, sensing the weight in his gaze but unsure how to respond. Is everything okay?" she asked cautiously. Maxwell hesitated, caught between the urge to reveal the truth and the need to protect her from a storm she had no part in. "Yes, everything is fine," he said finally, though the words rang hollow. He had never lied with such intent to protect someone, and the sensation was disorienting. As their conversation drew to a close, Maxwell realized that he could not linger. Staying longer would risk exposing the depth of his emotions, and Jessie's trust was fragile. He stood abruptly, the movement sharp and commanding once again. "Thank you for your time," he said, his voice regaining the precision of a man used to commanding attention. Jessie nodded, still puzzled but relieved the conversation ended without tension. She returned to the floor, the locket resting against her chest, unaware that the simple piece of jewelry she wore had triggered the unraveling of a powerful man's world. Once outside, Maxwell exhaled sharply, the cool night air doing little to calm the storm within. Every instinct screamed at him to act, to find answers, but he knew he needed a plan. A direct approach would terrify her, and he could not risk that. The world he inhabited was one of shadows and subtlety, and tonight, he would need all his skills for a purpose far more personal than any contract or threat he had ever executed. He walked with a steady stride toward his car, the city's lights casting long, fractured reflections across the pavement. Each step carried the weight of decades of unanswered questions, grief unprocessed, and a fragile hope he had long abandoned. If he misstepped, he could lose her again before he even knew the truth. By the time he arrived at his private office, the decision had solidified in his mind. This required someone meticulous, someone who could trace roots and histories without raising alarms. Maxwell dialed a number he rarely used, a number connected to a retired private investigator who had once worked quietly for him on sensitive matters. "Anton," he said, voice low but commanding, I need you to discreetly investigate someone for me. No one can know, not even the staff at the restaurant. I need complete information. Birth records, adoption papers, any inconsistencies you can find. I need a history of this young woman. Quietly. Anton, a seasoned investigator, paused only briefly before responding with professional calm. Understood. Discretion guaranteed. I'll start immediately. Maxwell hung up and leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. The path forward was uncertain, fraught with danger both from his enemies and the possibility of devastating emotional consequences. Yet one thing was clear: he could no longer ignore the flicker of hope that Jesse represented. The first confrontation had revealed only fragments of the truth, but it had also ignited a fire he could not extinguish. Hours later, as the city slept under the watchful gaze of streetlights and neon signs, Jessie returned home. She unwound the day in quiet reflection, unaware of the storm that Maxwell had unleashed in his world. She traced the locket with her fingers again, a comforting ritual, and felt an inexplicable sense of destiny brushing against her life. Somewhere far away, Maxwell reviewed old photographs and mental archives of his life with Helena. Every detail, every memory, every subtle inconsistency began to converge in his mind. The locket, the girl, the timing, everything pointed toward a connection he had dared not hope for but now could not ignore. The investigation was set in motion. The first step in uncovering the truth of Jesse's origin had been taken, and Maxwell knew that the next encounters would require patience, subtlety, and a steady hand. For in the world he commanded, every move could be exploited, every vulnerability exposed. But this was a game unlike any he had played before. And deep in the shadows of the city, unseen rivals had already taken notice of Maxwell's distraction. Whispers circulated in underground circles. The kingpin was unsettled. A crack in the armor had appeared, and opportunists were ready to strike. Yet Maxwell's focus remained unshaken, his determination hardened by the possibility of reclaiming what had been stolen from him so long ago. Tonight had been the first confrontation, but Maxwell knew it was only the beginning. Every thread he tugged, every secret uncovered, would bring him closer to the truth, and to the daughter he had lost and thought he would never find. The city slept, but Maxwell Langford did not. He was already moving, already calculating, already preparing for the moments that would define not just his empire, but his heart. Maxwell sat in his private office, the dim light from the desk lamp casting long shadows across the walls lined with trophies of power and danger. Outside, the city's pulse was muted by the late hour, yet inside, a storm of anticipation swirled in the quiet hum of the room. Anton, the retired private investigator Maxwell had trusted for years, was methodically sifting through documents, old hospital records, adoption papers, and birth certificates. "Here," Anton said, pushing a thin file across the desk. "Take a look at this." Maxwell's eyes scanned the pages quickly, trained to notice discrepancies at a glance. And there it was, the subtle alterations in the hospital records, the mismatched signatures, the inconsistent notes from nurses and administrators. He frowned, a cold, precise calculation forming in his mind. This wasn't negligence. This was deliberate. Someone had gone to great lengths to erase a child from the world she was born into. He picked up another paper, tracing the details with a finger. Her birthday matches. Exactly 20 years ago. Same month, same day. Maxwell exhaled, a mix of disbelief and hope tightening his chest. And the locket? It's identical to the one Helena had. Same engraving, same design. Anton nodded. "I've traced it. The locket's origin is unusual. Custom-made decades ago, not sold anywhere public. Whoever gave it to her, adoptive or otherwise, was unknowingly holding on to a piece of the past." The weight of the revelation settled on Maxwell like a physical presence. Every instinct told him to protect this girl, to approach her gently, but the stakes were enormous. The underworld thrived on vulnerability, and his own enemies would sense any weakness immediately. Meanwhile, Jessie went about her day, blissfully unaware that her life was about to change. Yet she could feel it, the faint shift in Maxwell's attention. At the restaurant, she noticed the way his eyes lingered just a second too long, the subtle nods and pauses that indicated he was watching, assessing. A mix of curiosity and unease crept into her chest. Something about him was different. During her lunch break, she twirled the locket between her fingers, feeling its cool metal and the faint inscription that had never made sense to her before. The thought of its origin stirred a quiet unease, an unspoken question that lingered at the edges of her mind. She didn't know why she felt compelled to examine it so often, but the sense that it mattered, that it connected her to something she couldn't name, was undeniable. Back in his office, Maxwell leaned forward, reviewing Anton's findings. "The adoption records," he murmured. "They were too clean. Too convenient. Look here, no fingerprints, no signatures that could be traced to real people. It's all fabricated." Anton's expression was grim. Someone planned this. Whoever it was, they made sure the trail went cold decades ago. But there are inconsistencies, small mistakes that, if pieced together, could point us in the right direction. Maxwell's mind raced. Memories of Helena flooded back. Her laughter, her warmth, the tragedy of her death and the loss of their newborn. He had buried his grief under an empire of fear and power, channeling his pain into control over the city's underworld. But this was different. This was personal. As he plotted his next moves, whispers in the city's shadows reached him. Maxwell's enemies, the subtle predators of the Mafia underworld, had noticed his distraction. A shipment was delayed, a rival gang member lingered too long near his usual routes, a message left at the back of a club carrying a veiled threat. They sensed weakness. They always sensed weakness. Yet Maxwell was beyond their reach for now. He had always played the game of shadows with precision, and he would not falter, not when the possibility of finding his daughter was at stake. He had learned to read patterns, to notice minutiae that others dismissed, and he poured that skill into the investigation. Jessie's day ended as it usually did, returning home to her modest apartment, preparing dinner for herself and her younger brother. The locket rested against her chest, warm from her touch, a comforting presence in the midst of the small chaos of her life. Yet tonight, she felt a subtle shift, a sense that something unseen was beginning to orbit around her, like a silent wind pushing her toward a truth she was not ready to face. At the same time, Maxwell received a message from Anton with the latest discoveries. There were names, dates, locations, a network of lies orchestrated by someone within the hospital system. A nurse who had since retired, a doctor long moved away, both involved in a conspiracy that had erased Jessie from her rightful place. The deeper he dug, the more precise the trail became. He paced his office, the polished floor reflecting the harsh light overhead. Each step was measured, each thought deliberate. To approach Jessie prematurely could shatter her trust, could alarm those who might still pose a threat. Yet delaying action carried its own dangers. Every day she lived unaware, the more vulnerable she could be to forces that had once decided her fate. Anton watched quietly. "There's more," he said finally, sliding another folder across the desk. Her adoption was not accidental. Someone made a choice, deliberate, calculated. It wasn't just negligence or a tragic mistake. They wanted her gone. Maxwell's jaw tightened. Anger simmered beneath the surface, coiled tightly with the rising hope. This wasn't just the past reaching into the present. This was a crime that had survived decades, one he had the power to confront. Meanwhile, back at the restaurant, Jessie began noticing small patterns in Maxwell's behavior. His visits were infrequent but consistent. His inquiries, polite yet probing, hinted at something he was not willing to reveal. The way he lingered near her table, the subtle questions, the gentle insistence that she take a moment with him in the quiet corners of the restaurant, all of it planted seeds of curiosity and suspicion in her mind. She confided in a close friend one evening. "There's something off about him," she said quietly. "Not in a bad way, exactly. It's like he's carrying a weight, and somehow he's looking at me because he sees something I don't." Her friend shrugged, offering comfort she could not fully feel. "Maybe he just likes your service. Or maybe he's complicated." Jessie laughed softly, but the unease lingered. There was a magnetic pull she couldn't explain, a connection she sensed but could not define. The locket, simple as it was, seemed to pulse against her chest like a heartbeat syncing with something beyond her understanding. Maxwell, reviewing Anton's latest findings, finally allowed himself a moment of pause. He stared at Jessie's photograph, comparing her features with Helena's, recalling memories of the child he never held. The resemblance was unmistakable. The locket was the final, silent confirmation. His heart raced. He had suspected, hoped even, but this tangible evidence made the impossible real. Jessie could be his daughter, the one he had mourned and assumed lost forever. And yet, the revelation was still incomplete. There were still threads to follow, questions to answer, and dangers to navigate. Maxwell knew that the path ahead would test every skill he had honed over decades in the underworld. Protecting Jessie, uncovering the truth, and confronting those responsible would demand cunning, patience, and unyielding resolve. As the night deepened, Maxwell made a decision. He would continue the investigation quietly, pulling the strings from the shadows. Jessie must remain unaware of the storm gathering around her. Every move had to be calculated, every risk weighed. This was no longer just a matter of uncovering a secret. It was about reclaiming what had been stolen and protecting it from those who would exploit it. And somewhere in the quiet hum of the city, as lights blinked in distant windows and sirens whispered in the distance, a young waitress traced the locket on her chest, oblivious to the network of truths, lies, and dangers beginning to converge on her life. The traces were clear now. The past had left its fingerprints, and Maxwell Langford was determined to follow them, no matter where they led, no matter the cost. Maxwell's office hummed with the quiet of late-night tension. Streetlights cast elongated shadows through the blinds, the city outside unaware of the storm brewing behind closed doors. He studied the latest intelligence Anton had gathered, each report more troubling than the last. The rival factions in his empire had caught wind of a shift, an unexplained vulnerability in the Langford operations. They didn't know the reason, but Maxwell didn't need them to. Their every move, every subtle threat, was a warning he could interpret perfectly. Jessie had become, unintentionally, a piece in this dangerous puzzle. Maxwell's heart clenched at the thought. She was unaware of the danger circling her life, the way the underworld's predators sensed weakness and moved to exploit it. She still walked through her days with an unburdened innocence, delivering orders, wiping tables, laughing with her coworkers. And yet, in the shadows of that restaurant, she was no longer untouchable. It began subtly at first. A delivery arrived at the restaurant, a package labeled incorrectly, bearing an address she didn't recognize. The courier's eyes lingered a second too long, and Jessie felt an unsteady knot in her stomach. She shook it off, blaming exhaustion, the stress of her family obligations, and the monotony of her life. But Maxwell, watching from a discreet distance, noted every detail. Every anomaly, every potential threat, became a piece of the larger, terrifying puzzle. Her shift continued, and then a man entered the restaurant, a stranger, tall and unkempt, his gaze scanning the room as though searching for someone. He paused near her station, lingering too long, breathing too heavily. Jessie's intuition prickled. Something about him felt wrong. Her pulse quickened, but she dismissed it, returning to her work with a forced smile. Yet even as she busied herself, a quiet dread settled in her chest. Maxwell observed it all through the tinted window of his car across the street. The sight of Jessie in even a minor peril ignited a cold fire inside him. The empire he had built through fear and strategy now had a new purpose: her safety. Every muscle in his body tightened as he calculated his response, weighing options that would shield her without revealing the truth of their connection. The family betrayal emerged quietly, insidiously. A distant relative, a cousin of his late wife Helena, had known the truth. She had known that the baby survived. The thought alone made Maxwell's chest constrict with anger. For decades, she had hidden it to secure her inheritance, to control the remnants of Helena's family fortune. Her greed had perpetuated Jessie's absence, her decisions rippling through time, shaping the girl's life without a single word spoken. Maxwell's fingers clenched around the edge of the car door. He felt a raw vulnerability he had long buried beneath his carefully constructed persona of control and intimidation. For the first time, the Mafia boss's thoughts were not of territory, power, or reputation. They were of a daughter he had never raised, whose life was unknowingly endangered by the sins of those around her. Meanwhile, back inside the restaurant, Jessie's shift drew to a close. The stranger had disappeared, leaving only a lingering sense of unease. She wiped down tables with deliberate slowness, sensing the weight of someone, or something, watching her. Her thoughts drifted to the locket around her neck, the small piece of jewelry that had always given her comfort. Little did she know, it was also a beacon, a link to a past she had never known, and the reason Maxwell's world had tilted entirely off balance. Outside, Maxwell was already in motion. His car roared through the quiet streets, silent in purpose, blending with the night as he traced the paths of potential threats. The Mafia code had always been simple: eliminate danger before it eliminates you. And now, that principle extended to the woman who unknowingly carried the legacy of his lost daughter. His first stop was the warehouse district, where intelligence suggested the courier had connections. He moved swiftly, the shadows of the city wrapping around him like a cloak. One by one, he intercepted leads, neutralizing minor threats with precision, threats that could have escalated into danger for Jesse. Each confrontation, each decision to use his power, weighed heavily on him, blurring the line between criminal ruthlessness and protective instinct. He returned home hours later, exhausted but unshaken in resolve. His thoughts returned, inevitably, to Jesse. The world outside his empire was fragile, unpredictable. And though she lived in that fragile world without knowing the danger, Maxwell realized he could not remain in the shadows forever. He needed to act, to create barriers, both seen and unseen, that would shield her from the ripples of past crimes and present enemies. The betrayal of his late wife's cousin gnawed at him. He began to piece together a strategy, not just for protection, but for confronting the betrayal that had robbed Jesse of her rightful place. Every move had to be subtle, every exposure measured. The game he had mastered for decades in the underworld now took a deeply personal dimension. It was no longer about loyalty or fear, it was about love. A complicated, messy, and terrifying love he had never allowed himself to feel before. Back at the restaurant the next day, Jesse felt the unease again, subtle but unmistakable. A delivery arrived, misdirected and hastily labeled. A shadow of a man loitered just outside the window. Her instincts screamed caution, yet she pushed them aside, still unaware of the network of vigilance that Maxwell had set in motion to guard her. Inside, Maxwell observed from a distance, orchestrating protective measures with his characteristic precision. Every guard placed, every route planned, every minor threat assessed. He became the silent guardian, operating unseen, an invisible shield around the woman who unknowingly held his heart. Even as he moved to protect her, Maxwell allowed himself brief flashes of imagined conversation, tentative moments where he could warn her, comfort her, claim her in a way he never had before. But prudence, honed over decades, restrained him. The timing had to be perfect. The truth had to be revealed in a way that would protect, not alarm. The cousin remained a shadowed threat. Maxwell began subtle investigations into her recent activities. Financial records, correspondences, meetings. The betrayal was not a theoretical one anymore. It was tangible, alive, and capable of inflicting harm if left unchecked. Every piece of evidence Maxwell gathered strengthened his resolve. Jesse's life would be safeguarded, and justice would be delivered to those who had hidden the truth for greed and power. That night, as the city slept under the glow of distant streetlights, Maxwell sat alone, reviewing Anton's reports. He allowed himself a rare moment of vulnerability. For a man who had lived decades in fear, rage, and control, these feelings were new, tender, unsettling, and strangely beautiful. He thought of Jessie, of her laughter, her courage, her unknowing bravery, and he knew that protecting her meant more than securing his empire. It meant protecting a fragment of his own heart. And deep inside, buried beneath layers of grief, guilt, and hardened instinct, Maxwell made a promise. No threat, no enemy, no shadow of the past would touch Jesse. He would navigate the dangers of the Mafia world, confront betrayal in his family, and face whatever consequences came, all to keep her safe. The weight of that promise settled on his shoulders like armor, and for the first time in years, Maxwell Langford felt the stirring of something wholly human, something he had long denied: hope. As Jesse closed the restaurant that night, the unease lingered, subtle but persistent. She didn't know that the quiet chaos around her had been orchestrated to protect her, that unseen hands moved to intercept danger before it reached her. All she felt was the tug of something larger, a presence she couldn't quite name. And in the shadows, Maxwell watched, vigilant, resolute, and painfully aware that the dangers of the past and present were converging. He would not falter. Jesse's life, her safety, and the possibility of reclaiming a lost bond were worth every calculated move, every confrontation, and every risk. Maxwell sat in the quiet of his office, the hum of the city outside almost soothing against the storm raging in his mind. Anton entered, carrying a thin folder wrapped in brown paper. "It's all here," he said quietly, placing it on the polished mahogany desk. "Every record, every altered document, the nurse's statement. It's enough to connect the dots." Maxwell's eyes scanned the contents, each page a blow to the decades of grief he had carried alone. The birth records had been falsified, Jesse's survival recorded as stillborn, adoption papers forged. Hospital staff involved in the cover-up had quietly moved on, leaving no trace, except for what Anton had dug up. Maxwell's hand trembled slightly as he reached for a photograph tucked inside the folder. A young nurse, her eyes avoiding the camera, standing beside a smiling doctor, the two of them unaware of the web they had spun. Jessie sat across from him. Her curiosity piqued when she was brought to his private office under the guise of discussing the locket again. Maxwell had insisted she come. The conversation needed privacy, away from the bustling restaurant and prying eyes. She looked at the folder, her brow furrowing. What is all this?" He hesitated, the words heavy on his tongue. "It's about you, Jesse," he said finally, choosing each carefully. "Your past. There are things you don't know about the day you were born." Jesse's eyes widened, and a shiver ran down her spine. She had always known the locket was a gift from her adoptive mother, cherished and personal, but the thought that it might mean something more, something tied to the man sitting across from her, was unsettling. "I don't understand," she whispered. Maxwell opened the folder, showing her the nurse's confession. The words were damning: deliberate removal of a baby from the nursery, falsifying birth records, selling the identity to a distant adoptive family. Jesse's heart pounded as she scanned the document. This can't be real," she said, shaking her head. "Why would anyone do that?" Flashbacks flooded Maxwell's mind, images of the hospital corridor, the cries of a newborn, Helena's pale, tear-streaked face. He had been there when doctors told him the baby didn't survive, a hollow ache replacing his hope. But now, decades later, the reality clawed its way back. The nurse and doctor had orchestrated the disappearance with clinical precision, motivated by greed, a willingness to manipulate life itself for profit. Jesse's disbelief lingered, but the evidence was undeniable. Her birth certificate, the papers from her adoption, even the locket itself, a piece passed down from a woman she barely knew, were proof that her life had been deliberately redirected. Maxwell watched her closely, seeing the whirlwind of emotions flicker across her face. Shock, anger, confusion, and the faintest glimmer of understanding. I don't know what to say," Jessie murmured, her hands clenching the locket around her neck. "All my life I thought I was ordinary. And this," she gestured at the folder, "this changes everything." Maxwell leaned forward, his voice softer than she had ever heard. "You are extraordinary, Jessie. You always were. And now, you know the truth." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "I've spent years, decades, thinking I had lost you forever. But you're here." For the first time, Jessie looked at him differently. No longer just the distant, imposing figure who commanded respect and fear, but a man touched by the same pain and loss she now understood. A subtle shift occurred in the room. The barrier of intimidation cracked, replaced by tentative connection. Maxwell gestured toward the folder again, guiding her through the details of the conspiracy. He described the nurse's motives, the doctor's greed, and the ways the adoption had been facilitated to prevent detection. Jessie listened intently, piecing together the fragments of her stolen past. Each revelation brought new clarity, yet also a deeper ache for the years lost. As the conversation unfolded, Maxwell's eyes lingered on her, not with the cold calculation of a mafia boss, but with the warmth of a father finally seeing the child he had mourned for so long. He could feel the subtle changes in his own heart, the beginnings of a bond forming through shared grief and shocking truth. Outside, the city's underworld continued its dance of shadows. Rival factions, sensing Maxwell's distraction, began to stir. They noticed the absence of his usual ruthlessness, the subtle cracks in his impervious exterior. Whispers of vulnerability reached ears that had long feared him. Unbeknownst to Jessie, The very revelations that bound her to Maxwell also made her a potential target, the ripples of danger stretching closer with each passing hour. Maxwell, however, was undeterred. He had learned to navigate threats with precision, and now, armed with knowledge and purpose, he planned his next moves carefully. Every decision would be measured, every step calculated to shield Jessie while uncovering the full truth of her life. "I need to know everything," Maxwell said finally, his tone steady but urgent. "Every record, every detail that confirms who you are. We need certainty." Jessie's gaze met his, a mixture of fear and tentative trust. "And if it's true, what then?" Maxwell's jaw tightened. "Then we protect you, and we make sure those who stole your life pay for what they did. I won't let anything happen to you, not now, not ever." The tension in the room was thick, but amidst it, a fragile sense of hope emerged. Father and daughter, separated by lies and deceit, were beginning to find each other. Their bond was tentative, raw, but undeniable. The shadows of the past had been unveiled, and though danger lurked, they were no longer alone in facing it. As the night deepened, Maxwell suggested the next step, a DNA test, definitive proof that would connect Jessie to him beyond doubt. The stakes had never been higher. The truth was imminent, and with it, the promise of reconciliation, justice, and the fragile beginnings of a new life together. By the time Jessie left Maxwell's office, clutching the locket with a mixture of fear and wonder, both knew that the next chapter of their lives, one of revelation, danger, and the first glimmers of familial trust, was only just beginning. The city slept, but in the shadows, plans were forming, truths were aligning, and the long-lost daughter of Maxwell Langford was finally awakening to her destiny. The sterile hum of the laboratory was almost unbearable, but Maxwell didn't flinch. He stood rigid, hands clasped tightly behind his back, watching as the technician slid the final DNA sample under the scanner. Beside him, Jessie's fingers twisted the chain of her locket nervously, a physical tether to the past she was only beginning to understand. The machine beeped. The results flashed on the monitor. Maxwell's breath caught in his throat. He stepped closer, eyes narrowing. The screen didn't lie. The match was undeniable. The numbers, the sequences, the markers, all aligned perfectly. Jessie Langford was, beyond any doubt, the daughter he had believed lost to him 20 years ago. Maxwell felt his knees weaken. 4 years, he had carried a shadow of grief, a void no wealth or power could fill. And now, standing in a quiet lab with the truth in front of him, that void exploded into raw, unfiltered emotion. He sank onto the nearest chair, and before he could even process it, tears spilled down his weathered face. Jessie froze, staring at him, the shock mirrored in her wide eyes. "Mr. Maxwell." Her voice wavered. "Is it true?" He couldn't speak. Words failed him. Instead, he reached out, trembling, and drew her close. She stiffened at first, hesitant, unsure of this man she barely knew but who was now, inexplicably, her father. The embrace was a collision of decades of loss, regret, and hope finally converging. Jessie's own tears came slowly, first as disbelief, then as grief for the years she had spent without him. "All my life, I thought I was just ordinary," she whispered into his shoulder. "And all this time I was," she broke off, shaking her head. "I was supposed to be someone else." "You were never ordinary," Maxwell murmured, voice raw. "Not to me. Not ever. I failed you once, but I won't again." His hands tightened around her, a silent vow that no threat, no shadow from his past, would ever touch her while he drew breath. The laboratory was silent but for their shared breaths and the soft beep of the machine. Outside, the world continued, unaware of the monumental revelation that had just unfolded within these walls. The stakes were enormous. Maxwell's rivals, long accustomed to exploiting any weakness, would learn of his distraction soon enough. But in that moment, he felt only the gravity of connection, the sharp clarity of fatherhood reclaimed. Jessie pulled back slightly, searching his eyes. "All those years, you thought I was gone. Her voice faltered. "I didn't even know how much I missed having a family." Maxwell's fingers brushed her cheek gently, a gesture of tenderness entirely foreign to the Mafia boss his enemies knew him to be. "And now, he said, voice steady despite the torrent within. "You're here, and I'll protect you, no matter the cost. No one will take you from me again." Their reunion was interrupted by the subtle tension of the outside world. Maxwell's inner circle had already sensed his emotional shift. The enemies he had neutralized, or thought neutralized, were circling, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, sensing vulnerability. But for the first time in decades, Maxwell had a motivation beyond power or revenge. He had something worth protecting. His daughter. Jessie, slowly absorbing the reality, allowed herself to trust him. "I want to know everything," she said quietly. "About why it happened, about you, about us." Maxwell nodded, feeling a strange mixture of dread and relief. "You will. And I promise, nothing will be hidden from you again. We'll face it together, whatever comes." For a moment, the world outside ceased to matter. Father and daughter, separated by deceit, fear, and years of loss, were finally united. The DNA confirmation wasn't just proof of identity, it was the bridge to a life they could begin to reclaim together. Maxwell's heart hardened against anyone who would threaten her. The city's shadows, the Mafia's whispers, all faded in importance compared to the life now intertwined with his own. Jessie was no longer an unknown variable. She was the most important person in his world, the daughter he had lost and found, and the reason he would now redefine everything in his life. As they left the lab, Maxwell's hand found Jessie's, firm and protective. He had vowed silently that no one, no rival, no traitor, no dark secret from his past, would ever harm her. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope that the world might finally bend in their favor, even if only slightly, as long as they faced it together. The journey ahead would be dangerous, filled with enemies and uncertainties. But tonight, in the quiet victory of revelation, they held each other, and the darkness of the past felt just a little less oppressive. The evening air was thick with tension as Maxwell drove through the city streets, Jessie riding silently beside him. The city lights reflected off the sleek black car, flickering against the determination etched into Maxwell's face. Ever since the DNA confirmation, he had known the enemies circling, those who had long been waiting for the perfect opportunity to exploit his newfound vulnerability. Tonight, the moment had arrived. Jessie's eyes darted nervously to the rearview mirror. "Dad, do you really think they'll come tonight?" she asked, voice calm but wary. Maxwell's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "They will. But they won't succeed. Not while I'm breathing." Their instincts proved correct. From the shadows of a narrow alley, two black SUVs emerged, engines growling like predators. A sudden sense of danger flooded the car. Maxwell's mind raced, instantly calculating the odds, escape routes, and countermeasures. "Hold on," he warned, slamming his foot down on the accelerator. The tires screeched, and the vehicles lunged forward in a deadly pursuit. The city became a blur of light and sound as Maxwell weaved through traffic with precision only years of underworld experience could grant. Jessie, gripping the edge of the seat, didn't flinch. Her composure, steady despite the chaos, impressed Maxwell more than he expected. "You're calm," he said, glancing at her. "Most people would be screaming." "I've had to deal with chaos my whole life," she replied, voice steady. "Besides, I trust you." That trust bolstered him. Using a series of calculated turns, sudden stops, and narrow escapes, Maxwell led the pursuers into a dead-end street. The SUVs skidded, horns blaring, as he executed a precise U-turn. Within moments, he had outmaneuvered them, the enemy's frustration palpable. But Maxwell knew the threat wasn't over. He had expected brute force, but the real danger was subtler: betrayal. His family circle had a traitor, someone who had known of Jessie's existence and sought to exploit it for inheritance. Tonight, the truth would finally come out. Back at the Langford estate, Maxwell confronted the relative in the dimly lit study. The man's posture was rigid, guilt and arrogance battling for dominance. Maxwell didn't hesitate. "You knew she survived," he said, voice cold and unwavering. "And you kept it hidden. Why?" The man faltered, eyes darting. I did it for the family. I thought I was protecting." "Protecting what?" Maxwell's voice cut through the lie like a blade. "Your inheritance." our pain. Or just yourself. The confession spilled out, bitter and reluctant. The relative admitted to falsifying records, manipulating the hospital staff, and ensuring Jesse's placement with adoptive parents. Maxwell listened, each word igniting a controlled fury within him. Justice was not about vengeance. It was about ensuring no one else could suffer because of this betrayal. Meanwhile, Jessie had followed him into the study, observing quietly. Despite the tension, she remained composed, her presence a steadying influence on Maxwell. He noted it, a quiet pride swelling in his chest. Her courage wasn't just bravery, it was wisdom born from survival. "You're stronger than you know," he said softly, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. The confrontation ended with the traitor's confession secured and plans in motion to prevent any further manipulation. Maxwell ensured the man would face consequences without resorting to unnecessary violence, a careful balance of justice and strategy. Later that night, as the city slept, Maxwell and Jessie stood together on the estate's balcony. The chaos of the evening still pulsed faintly in their veins, but a sense of relief hovered over them. "We did it," Jessie said quietly, leaning against him. "Tonight, at least, it's over." "For now," Maxwell replied, scanning the horizon. "The city doesn't forget, and neither do our enemies. But tonight, we survived. And we survived together." He looked down at her, and the bond between them solidified further. Father and daughter united not just by blood, but by shared resilience and trust. Every calculated maneuver, every strategic decision, had been for her. Every ounce of power he wielded now had a purpose beyond fear. It was to protect her, guide her, and build a future where she was safe. Jessie's hand found his, fingers interlacing. "I'm ready to face whatever comes next," she said, voice unwavering. Maxwell nodded. "So am I." Though immediate threats had been neutralized and justice partially served, Maxwell knew the larger dangers still loomed. Enemies would regroup, shadows of the past would try to claw back, and the underworld would never forgive weakness. But tonight had proved something far more important. Together, they could confront anything. The city stretched below them, unaware of the battle waged and won in its quiet corners. But in the hearts of Maxwell and Jessie, a new chapter had begun, one built on trust, courage, and an unbreakable bond. Whatever came next, they would face it side by side. The night air carried a faint promise of hope, but Maxwell's instincts reminded him, vigilance was necessary. Their journey wasn't over. The past had been confronted, the immediate threat dismantled, but the larger war for family, legacy, and survival had only just begun. Maxwell tightened his grip on Jessie's hand and whispered, "We'll be ready. Together." The darkness of the city outside was vast, but the light they carried within was stronger. And with that, they prepared for the trials that would inevitably follow. The morning sunlight spilled gently across the Langford estate, painting the walls with warmth and quiet promise. For the first time in decades, Maxwell allowed himself to breathe fully, the weight of old grief and relentless guilt lifting just enough to feel present in this moment. Jessie stood beside him on the balcony, her hand brushing against his, a silent affirmation of trust and newfound connection. "You know," Maxwell began, his voice low and tentative, "I never thought I'd get a second chance. Not with this." He gestured vaguely toward the city below, toward the life that had once been full of danger, secrets, and blood. "Not with you." Jessie looked up at him, eyes steady, a small smile forming. "We have it now," she said softly. "We get to build something real. Something that's ours." The quiet was broken by the distant hum of cameras and the faint chatter of reporters. Overnight, the news had spread. Jessie Langford, long believed to be someone else entirely, was the daughter of Maxwell Langford. The media buzzed with fascination, scandal, and intrigue, but Maxwell hardly noticed. He only saw her, alive, standing here with him, safe. Their private moment was soon joined by the arrival of the authorities. The hospital conspirators had been tracked, confronted, and brought to justice. The corrupt nurse, the doctor who had tampered with records, even the distant relative who had hidden Jessie's existence for inheritance, all were exposed, facing the consequences of decades-old crimes. The legal system moved slowly, but it moved decisively, offering Maxwell and Jessie a sense of closure that no money or power had ever provided. Jessie's eyes glistened with emotion as she processed the victories and the truths of her past. "It's overwhelming," she admitted. I never imagined any of this was possible." Maxwell, placing a protective arm around her shoulder, nodded. "You've been through more than most people could bear, and yet, look at you. Strong, calm, unshakable. I'm proud of you, Jessie. More than words can say." They walked slowly through the estate, each step deliberate, savoring the moment without needing to speak. Maxwell had always known power in terms of fear, influence, and control. But here, in these quiet corridors, he understood the power of love, trust, and family. This, protecting Jessie, being present, being honest, was more formidable than any empire he had built. The media frenzy continued outside the walls, but Maxwell made a decision. No longer would his life be dictated solely by shadows and threats. Public acknowledgement of his paternity was a risk, yes, but one that allowed him to step out of the darkness with integrity. During an interview, he spoke with deliberate care. "Jessie is my daughter. She always was. I cannot undo the past, but I can be here for her now. And I intend to." Jessie watched him, pride mingled with relief. The city might see a mafia boss confessing to fatherhood, but she knew the truth beneath it all. Maxwell had changed. Not overnight, not without struggle, but through love, fear, courage, and a willingness to confront his own past. Later, as the estate quieted for the evening, Jessie and Maxwell sat in the garden, surrounded by the familiar scent of blooming flowers. Tears came freely, unashamed, as decades of grief, fear, and longing found release. Maxwell hugged her tightly, and she returned the embrace, the bond between father and daughter finally unbroken. Words were unnecessary. Their hearts spoke in the language of relief, forgiveness, and hope. "I forgive you," Jessie whispered. "Not for what you did, there's nothing to forgive, but for the years we lost. I forgive the world for hiding me from you, and I forgive you for surviving without me for so long." Maxwell's throat tightened. "I'll never forgive myself for that," he admitted. "But I can try to be here from now on. That's all I can do." The evening shadows lengthened, but neither felt the chill. The past remained behind them, and ahead lay a future that neither could have imagined before tonight. They walked together through the estate gates, side by side, the city's lights sparkling like a promise. Maxwell's hand brushed lightly against Jessie's, a simple gesture loaded with meaning, safety, commitment, and love. As they stepped into a quieter street, away from the empire of fear he had once ruled, Maxwell felt the weight of his life's choices settle into clarity. Jessie's presence reminded him that redemption was possible, that legacy wasn't built on power or intimidation, but on care, protection, and family. The city stretched out, alive and indifferent, yet within this small circle of warmth, they had created a world entirely their own. The shadows of Maxwell's past, the betrayals, the violence, and the secrets, all had been confronted, all had been accounted for. What remained was a clean slate, a chance to live without fear, to nurture trust, and to embrace the life they had earned together. Jessie glanced up at him, her expression open, hopeful. "Where do we go from here?" Maxwell smiled, a rare softness in a face long hardened by life. "Wherever we choose. Together." They walked into the night, leaving behind the chaos, leaving behind the enemies, leaving behind the pain. Ahead lay family dinners without fear, laughter without suspicion, and days where the only battles were the ones they chose to fight together. As the stars began to shimmer above the city skyline, Maxwell whispered, almost to himself, "No more secrets, no more shadows. Just us." Jessie squeezed his hand, her voice firm, carrying the promise of the future. "Just us." And with that, they stepped forward, father and daughter, into a life rebuilt, not in the shadows of fear, but in the light of love, reconciliation, and hope. The past had been confronted. Justice had been served. And finally, for Maxwell and Jessie, the long-lost bond of family had been restored. "Every family has its shadows," Maxwell said softly, looking at Jessie with a faint smile. "But love always finds a way." Jessie nodded. "And we'll make sure it stays that way." Together, they walked into the city that once seemed hostile, now brimming with possibility. A life outside the Mafia, a future built on trust, and the unbreakable bond of a father and daughter reunited. The darkness of their past had been faced, and the dawn of a new beginning rose, promising a world where love and courage outweighed fear and betrayal.